Happy Sabbath once again. This past week I've been thinking much of all the blessings that I have received, that God has filled my life, all the good things that God has given me, and I can truly say that I'm blessed. And this is a reflection that we tend to do during Thanksgiving season. And as I look at my life, as I look at the different things that are happening, I can say I'm happy, I'm content. I look forward to what the future holds, and I just feel that, well, life is going really good. But as I pondered on that and on how blessed I am and the things that God has given me, I then asked another sobering question. What if life wasn't going well for me? What if I didn't feel so blessed? What if everything was going wrong? What if I was struck with a severe sickness lying in bed? Would this be enough? And so this week, that has been the thought, the question that I've been asking myself. And I don't know if you've ever asked yourself that question, or if you've ever tried to look into the future, to a time where maybe you're going through great trial and difficulty. Will your heart fail you? Would your heart fail to find comfort in the thought that, well, you lost everything, you don't have anything, but you still have Jesus? This morning, this is the reflection I would like for you to make. When that time comes, and if you believe in the Word of God and in prophecy, let me assure you, there will come a time where we will lose many of the blessings that we enjoy today. Will Jesus be enough for you at that time? Open your Bibles to Revelation chapter 13. Let me remind you of something you already know, those of you who study prophecy. Revelation chapter 13. Beginning with verse 1. On the island of Patmos was revealed the future events, the closing scenes of the last great conflict between God and Satan. And in Revelation chapter 13, beginning with verse 1, he says, I stood upon the sand of the sea and saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his heads the name of blasphemy. In verse 3 he says, and I saw one of his heads as it were wounded to death, and his deadly wound was healed. And then he says, and all the world did what? They wondered after the beast. Verse 4, and they worshipped the dragon which gave power unto the beast, and they worshipped the beast, saying, who is like unto the beast, and who is able to make war with him? You see, what John was seeing was a power. We know that in Bible prophecy, a beast represents a nation, a kingdom. He saw this power that all the world was wondering after, and the question arose in his head, who is able to make war with this nation? Verse 6, he says, and he opened his mouth in blasphemy against God, to blaspheme his name and his tabernacle, and them that dwell in heaven. And it was given unto him to make war with who? With the saints. Not just to make war with them, but to actually overcome them. And power was given him over all kindreds and tongues and nations, and all that dwell upon the earth shall worship him, whose names were not written in the book of life, in the book of life of the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. Revelation 12:17 tells us why all this is happening, because the dragon is wroth with the woman, and so he goes to make war with the remnant of her seed. Prophecy tells us that there's going to come a time when a nation will arise, and this power, it says, John says, power was given to him, or he was allowed to make war with the saints, with those who fear God, with those who keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus. When you lose everything, when that time comes when you cannot buy or sell, will Jesus be enough for you? And if you want to get a better picture of this coming conflict, of what John saw in the Revelation, the book Great Controversy describes it in more detail. And if you read there in the introduction, she says, "As the Spirit of God opened to my mind the great truths of His Word and the scenes of the past and the future, I have been bidden to make known to others what has thus been revealed, to trace the history of the conflict, of the controversy in past ages, especially to present it as to shed a light on the fast approaching struggle on the future. In the records of the past, we may see a foreshadowing of the conflict before us." So when you look, and so in the book of Great Controversy, it deals with history. It goes through the history of the early church, goes through the church during the Dark Ages, and there, and in history books, you can get a picture of what the future conflict will be like. I continue reading from the same book, the introduction. "In the great final conflict, Satan will employ the same policy and manifest the same spirit and work for the same end as in all preceding ages. That which has been will be," but there's a difference, she says, "except that the coming struggle will be marked with a terrible intensity such as the world has never witnessed. Satan's deceptions will be more subtle, his assaults more determined, and if it were possible, he would lead astray the elect." That's what Jesus said, Mark chapter 13, verse 22. The coming conflict, terrible in intensity, but you can get a picture of it when you look at the past. I don't know how many of you have read of the experience of early Christians being persecuted, first by the Roman Empire, starting with Nero, and then when the papacy arose and then became the persecuting power, the Waldensians. Many Christians suffered much. They lost houses, lands, family, and even eventually they even lost, many of them, their own lives. Are you fearful of losing things, your house, your job, possessions, family members? You know, we are not at that time yet. Again, this is what prophecy shows us, and prophecy foretells that it will come. But we're not exactly there yet. And we still live in a time of relative peace and prosperity. And so we have to ask ourselves the question now, is Jesus enough for me now? Because the only way to really know if he's going to be enough for me then, if he will be enough for me in the future when that time comes, is if he's enough for you now, today. What draws you to Jesus? What keeps you coming to church? Jesus had many followers in the early part of his ministry. Many people flocked to hear Jesus' words. Many came to receive healing from him. And even today, when you look at Christianity, Christianity is the number one, the largest religion in the world. With over 2.5 billion followers, 32% of the population of the world is Christian. But how many of these are genuine seekers? For how many of these individuals is Jesus everything for them? Open your Bibles to John chapter 6. In John chapter 6, we see that many people followed Jesus. But we can also see here in John chapter 6 the motive that led many people to follow Jesus. Beginning with verse 1, after these things Jesus went over the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias, and a great multitude followed him. Why? Because they saw his miracles which he did on them that were diseased. So here we have the motive described for many of the people, those multitudes that were flocking to see Jesus. They were following him because of the miracles. And then later on in the chapter, if you read in verse 26, if you read the rest of the story, a large multitude had gathered together, 5,000 men. They were there, and this is where Jesus blesses the 5 barley loaves and the 2 fishes, and he multiplies it, and he feeds the multitude that was there because he had compassion on the people. The people were hungry. They had been listening to his words. And so he does this great miracle. And so, again, many people followed him because they saw him heal other people. But in this miracle, every single person that was there, they experienced the miracle because they ate of that food that Jesus had multiplied. And towards the end of this day, many people wanted to make Jesus right then and there, and Jesus understood what their intentions were, and he sent the multitudes away. He made his way out. He sent the disciples away. They got on the ship. He went to a mountain, and later that night, he meets the disciples. This is where Jesus walks on water, and he goes into the ship. And the next day, they arrive at the other side. They arrive in Capernaum, and the people were still looking for Jesus. They had just experienced this mighty miracle, and they were wondering where Jesus was, and they finally found him. And in verse 26, look at what Jesus said. Let's read verse 25. And when they had found him on the other side of the sea, they said unto him, Rabbi, when camest thou hither? Jesus answered them and said, Verily, verily, I say unto you, ye seek me, not because ye saw the miracles, but because ye did eat of the loaves and were filled. And now Jesus wants to try to turn their eyes away from the temporal benefits that they had received, and he wants them to seek him, but for the spiritual blessings that he wished to give them. And so he tells them, he says, labor not for the meat which perisheth, but for that meat which endureth unto everlasting life, which the Son of Man shall give unto you. For him hath God the Father sealed. In The Desire of Ages, Ellen White describes a little bit more the feelings of the people. She tells us they did not seek him for any worthy motive. But as they had been fed with the loaves, they hoped still to receive temporal benefit by attaching themselves to him. So they were drawn to Jesus because of the temporal benefits that they had received from him. She goes on saying, their dissatisfied hearts queried, why, if Jesus could perform so many wondrous works as they had witnessed, could he not give health, strength, and riches to all his people? Free them from their oppressors and exalt them to power and honor. They were all thinking about what Jesus could do for them. Why doesn't he give us health, strength, riches? And sometimes we can look at God, we can look at Jesus that same way. Lord, bless me with health. Lord, give me this. Lord, I need this. And we're coming to him just because of all the temporal benefits we wish to receive from him. Turn to verse 51. You see, Jesus understood the motives of the people. And it's interesting, he tested the people at this moment. And what happens is that when the only thing that Jesus offered them was his life, many turned away. Many turned away. Verse 51 of chapter 6, John chapter 6, Jesus says, I am the living bread which came down from heaven. If any man eat of this bread, he shall live forever. And the bread that I will give is my flesh, which I will give for the life of the world. He was offering them his life. Verse 52, the Jews therefore strove among themselves, saying, how can this man give us his flesh to eat? See, they had missed the point completely. But it's interesting, again, they were not so naive. This question that they raised was like the question Nicodemus raised to Jesus. How can a man being born, grown up, go back into his mother's womb and be born again? They knew that that's not what Jesus was saying, but they still questioned it because they didn't want to accept the truth that was being brought out. Verse 58, Jesus says, again, he repeats what he has been telling them. This is the bread which came down from heaven, not as your fathers did eat manna and are dead. He that eateth of this bread shall live forever. He was offering them his life. But again, this did not appeal to them because they were seeking Jesus for all the temporal benefits. And in verse 66 it says, from that time many of his disciples went back and walked no more with him. And then the next verse tells us, verse 67, then Jesus said unto the 12, will ye also go away? So a great multitude of those disciples of Jesus turned back from following him because Jesus had, he had crushed their hopes and desires to receive temporal benefits from him. He just offered them his life, his companionship, his presence. And they weren't interested in that. And so Jesus asked the same question to the disciples. But even though the disciples, they also had some desires for temporal benefits, they were a lot more sincere in their coming after Jesus. Of one of those, Matthew, in the Desire of Ages, and we can read it in the Gospels also, when Jesus calls him, he had a good business. He was a publican. He was making good money. And the Desire of Ages tells us Matthew, when he received that call, Matthew left all. He rose up and followed Jesus. There was no hesitation, no questioning, no thought of the lucrative business to be exchanged for poverty and hardship. It was enough for him that he was to be with Jesus, that he might listen to his words and unite with him in his work. Is Jesus enough for you? Is that enough for you? Just to know that you have Jesus, that you can unite with him in your work, even though you're not being offered any good temporal benefits. You know, when we look to sign up for a job, we're you look at, okay, what are the benefits? What are they going to pay me? What am I going to get in return for this? Is Jesus enough for you now? You know, God created us in a way that there are certain things that are outside of God that satisfy certain needs that we have as human beings. So, you know, God created us with the sense of hunger, right? And when you feel hungry, what satisfies that need? You know, food. You know, and God created us this way. You know, God could have just sustained our life by some other way or manner, but He put that need in us. You know, thirst is the same way. You feel thirsty, and so you know, if you eat or if you take a deep breath, it does not satisfy your thirst. Only, you know, water, you need water to quench that need. And as human beings, we have many of these different needs. We have social needs, we have emotional needs, all these different things that God actually created us with these needs. And those needs are supplied through the vehicle He has chosen. Now, let me ask you a question. If I'm hungry, let's say for the last 2-3 weeks I've only been eating one scarce meal a day, and you know I'm feeling the gnawing pain in my stomach, and I don't have no idea when to expect my next meal. Is Jesus enough? Does His presence, does fellowship with Jesus satisfy my need of hunger? Now think about that question. Now again, God created us in a way, you know, and He made us this way that, you know, food is what actually satisfies that need. And so there's two ways you can answer this question. Now, if you mean that Jesus will, you know, just having fellowship or prayer will take away my sense of hunger, then the answer is no. You know, I don't know how many of you, you know, maybe for a little bit of time, devotion, you know, can kind of distract me from my hunger, but eventually it's going to get to me, right? You know, we know that Jesus, when He was in the desert, you know, He was there 40 days and He was fasting and He was in communion with the Father, but His sense of hunger never left Him completely. He felt a deep sense of hunger. For a time it was you know, he didn't feel the intensity of it, but there came a moment in time where it was there and it was real. So in one sense the answer is no, but in another sense it can be yes. How so? Well, even though I'm hungry, even though I'm starving, I haven't had food, you can still be content. You can still be happy that you have Him, even though you don't have food. Even though you have this deep need, your body is crying out for food, but I can still trust that God knows my need, and if God sees fit for me to suffer this hunger, I'll accept it, and I'll be happy, and Jesus will be enough for me. And the reason I bring this up is because, again, we may experience that. That's one of those things that it says again, in the book, Great Controversy, talking about the closing scenes, one of those things that we're going to be tested on is you're going to experience hunger. You're going to experience weariness, lack of sleep. Is it going to get to you so much that it will take and rob your peace of mind and soul? Turn in your Bibles to the book of Job. I want to look at some different characters in the Bible that experienced lack in their life. We know the story of Job, and Job, he had everything and then he lost it all. And I want you to notice the accusation that Satan brings to God in Job chapter 1. And again, do you think that that Satan might still bring this accusation against us? Job chapter 1, beginning with verse 6, "Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them. And the Lord said unto Satan, Whence comest thou? And Satan answered the Lord and said, From going to and fro in the earth, and walking up and down in it. And the Lord said to Satan, Hast thou considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on earth, a perfect and an upright man, one that feareth God and escheweth evil?" Notice Satan's reply. Then Satan answered the Lord and said, "Doth Job fear God for naught?" In other words, he's saying, do you think he's faithful to you? Do you think he serves you for nothing? Oh, no way. He goes on saying, "Hast thou not made a hedge about him, about his house, and about all that he has on every side? You've blessed the work of his hands, and his substance is increased in the land." God, of course Job is going to be faithful to you. Of course he's going to serve you. Look how you bless him. And then here comes Satan's challenge. "But put forth thine hand now, and touch all that he has, and he will curse thee to thy face." If we were placed in that challenge, if we faced what Job faced, could we respond the same way? Would Jesus be enough for you if you lost it all? Or would Satan's accusation prove true? We were like the other disciples that we read about in John chapter 6, that they were fine and happy with Jesus as long as they were receiving temporal benefits from him, as long as they were being blessed. Job was tested in his loyalty, in his love towards God. What about if you went through an experience like Jeremiah? If you turn to Jeremiah chapter 16, just one of his experiences, he suffered much and went through much hardship, but one of the things, and this is for all those of you who are single here, Jeremiah chapter 16, verse 1 and 2. "The word of the Lord came also unto me, saying, Thou shalt not take a wife, neither shalt sons or daughters in this place. If that was your experience, would Jesus be enough? Or would you fret? Would you complain? Because you weren't allowed to have a family. How would you feel? Or even worse, going through the experience that Ezekiel went through. In Ezekiel chapter 24, Ezekiel had a wife and he lost her. Ezekiel chapter 24, verse 15 and 16, the word of the Lord came unto me, saying, Son of man, behold, I do what? I take away from thee the desire of thine eyes with a stroke, yet neither shalt thou mourn nor weep, neither shall thy tears run down. If you lost your wife, if you lost your husband, if you lost one of your children, would Jesus still be enough? Could your heart still find fulfillment in him? I have a friend that just about 2 years ago lost his father. Previously, few years before that, had lost his mother. And when he lost his father, he became bitter and angry towards God. Why did you take away my father? Those type of things, they hit us. Will Jesus be enough when you experience loss? Or what about the experience of Elisha? Turn to 2 Kings 13, verse 14. 2 Kings, verse 13, 2 Kings chapter 13, verse 14 tells us, Now Elisha was fallen sick of his sickness whereof he died. Now, if you've read and heard about the story of Elisha, Elisha was one of the greatest prophets in the Old Testament. He's probably one of the prophets that that did so many, that we have recorded many of the miracles that he did. He healed people who had leprosy. He healed other people, that were diseased. God used him to raise people from the dead. Many miracles. He did many miracles. And now, at the end of his life, he's stricken with a sickness that eventually kills him. What would you do? Think about this. What if God allowed a terrible disease to come upon you when you've been faithful to the health message and faithfully serving God? You've been doing everything right, and you get this disease that eventually takes your life away. Will Jesus still be enough for you in your disease, in your affliction? And again, this disease in Prophets and Kings, page 263, it wasn't just, he got sick and died. Let me read a little bit to you. It was not given Elisha to follow his master in a fiery chariot. Upon him the Lord permitted to come a lingering illness during the long hours of human weakness and suffering. This is what he experienced. Elisha, great prophet. His predecessor, God took him in a chariot of fire to heaven. And now he, upon whom a double portion of the Spirit rested upon him when Elisha left, he's in a sick bed. A long, lingering disease that was bringing suffering and pain to him. Would Jesus be enough for you if you found yourself in that situation? Or would your heart be stirred up with complaint and questionings of why, Lord, why me, when I've done everything right. And again, this is a reality. My grandmother, she was very faithful Adventist, faithful to the health message, and she died of a cancer, liver cancer. She never drank in her life. She died of liver cancer, and all my family is Adventists, and my mother and my aunts, they were all asking, why, Lord, why does she get cancer? And her husband, who, my grandfather, who, not a good Adventist, not in the health message, and he still lives on, he's in his 90s, and he's doing everything wrong. Colossians chapter 2, verse 10, our scripture reading. Colossians chapter 2, verse 10. Paul wrote to the believers there in Colossians, and he said, and ye are what? Complete in him. What does it mean to be complete? Nothing missing. You can't complain about anything. Everything is there. You're complete in him. And in the book Faith and Works, and the quote is there in your bulletin, it says, ye are complete in him, Colossians 2:10. How what? What's the next word there? How hard is it for humanity, long accustomed to cherished doubt, to grasp this great truth? But what peace it brings to the soul, what vital life. Ye are complete in him. But it's so hard, she says, it's so hard for us, for humans who long cherish doubt, to say, hey, if I'm feeling hungry right now, I can't be complete in God. If I don't have this, if I lose my job, if I'm poor, if I'm homeless, if my family dies, how can I be complete in him when I'm missing all these things, all these basic necessities? What does it mean to be complete in him? And how can we experience it? Paul was warning the believers, and specifically here when Paul tells them, you are complete in him, he was specifically dealing with the issue of salvation. Because the believers were being deceived into thinking that they needed to do this, they needed to add this to their religious experience in order to be completely saved. And so he warns them, and beginning with verse 1, he says, for I would that ye knew what great conflict I have for you and for them at Laodicea. And as for many as have not seen my face in the flesh, that their hearts might be comforted, being knit together in love, and unto all riches of the full assurance of understanding, to the acknowledgement of the mystery of God and the Father and of Christ, in whom are hid all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. And this I say, lest any man should beguile you with enticing words. And then in verse 8, again, he repeats his thought. He says, beware lest any man spoil you through philosophy and vain deceit, after the traditions of men, after the rudiments of the world, and not after Christ. The Word of God tells us you are complete in him. The world says you can't be complete and happy unless you have this, and this. And again, even our own selves, there's desires and things that we want, and we feel that we can't be complete and happy unless we have those things. But you have to come to reality, and again, maybe we're not experiencing the loss now, but if we live long enough and we go through what prophecy foretells, you will lose everything. And you are going to suffer. You're going to suffer. Will Jesus be enough? Will it be enough? Will you feel, will you know that you are complete in Him, though you lack all those external material blessings? Is love for Jesus strong enough to motivate you to get your life in order now? Or do you need to hear some, startling, exciting message? Do you need to know that the Sunday law is coming next year to get your life in order? Or is Jesus enough? Desire for His companionship, love for Him enough to lead you to get your life right? Psalm 73, verse 26. I pray and hope that each of us could say like David in Psalm 73, verse 26. The psalmist said, "My flesh and my heart do what? They fail." My strength is gone, my heart is broken, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever. For the psalmist, Jesus was enough. It was enough to have God, even though he had lost his strength and his heart was failing within him. God was enough for him. In Philippians chapter 3, and we will close with the passage. Philippians chapter 3. Paul spends some time describing all his earthly attainments. And then, after describing those things, in verse 7 he says, "But what things were gain unto me, those I counted loss for Christ. Yeah, doubtless, and I count all things but loss for the excellency of the knowledge of Jesus my Lord, for whom I have suffered the loss of all things." Not just that he lost them, but how did he look at those things that he lost? He considered them dung, refuse, garbage, compared in comparison to having who? To having Jesus. The knowledge of Jesus. That I may win Christ. He was willing to lose everything if only he could keep hold of Christ. And be found in him, not having mine own righteousness of the law, but that which is through the faith of Christ, the righteousness which is of God by faith. And my appeal to you this morning is that you would seek him, and that the great longing and cry of your heart would be, "Lord, give me Jesus." And that's enough. That's sufficient. That's sufficient. I invite you to open your hymnals with me to 305. And let this come out as a prayer from our hearts this morning. Give